I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. My guest today is my Hudson Institute colleague, James Barnett. He is a research fellow based in Nigeria, and in this conversation we discuss everything from West Africa to the Horn of Africa and everything in between. We especially focused on the region through the lens of great power competition and counterterrorism, while also making clear that these very DC foreign policy-centric terms might not always apply when we're analyzing regional problems.
But I think in terms of, kind of like the overall impact, what's really going to shape Africa moving forward. I think that, a lot of it will be kind of in the economic sphere. And so it's going to be in this question as well about, does all of this FDI, whether it was the billions in Chinese FDI over the past decade or so now, whether it's the Gulf money, the U.S. is trying to some extent to catch up, but it's, we have a very different system than either the Gulf states, or China, right? We don't really have these massive parastatals with billions of dollars. We don't have a massive petro-funded sovereign wealth fund. So it's a lot harder for, the president can't just say, yeah, let's spend $4 billion in this country to, build roads or whatever. It doesn't quite work like that in the American system.
Huge thanks. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. James Barnett, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks very much, Marshall. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. This is your first time on the show. Something I like to do when we're speaking to people within the Hudson Cinematic Universe is give a quick introduction. What's your background? What's your focus area? You're coming to us from Nigeria, I believe. So that's a particularly good opportunity to give some context on your work here.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Marshall. Always good to share my origin story, I guess. I've been based overseas for the past about 4 years now, principally in Nigeria. So I'm a non-resident fellow with Hudson, though in the beauty of this kind of post-COVID age and such, I'm able to stay engaged with the Institute in various ways, including, through stuff like this podcast, which, I was very excited about it. Was it a year ago or so that you guys started this new series? It's been really, really interesting and good way for me to kind of keep track of what's happening in other parts of the world outside of my own area. So I principally work on issues of conflict and security in Africa. I've been based in Nigeria the past few years. I moved here at the start of 2021 as a Fulbright research fellow, and then kind of stayed on, engaged in a bunch of different projects and kind of researching with different institutions. I'm affiliated as well with a think tank in Nigeria. And I've worked with different organizations, such as like International Republican Institute, different kind of international NGOs and stuff involved in kind of like trying to understand conflict and also broader political issues and kind of, to sound a bit academic, kind of like the political economy of violence in regions like Nigeria, but also working a bit in the Horn of Africa, including some work in Somalia, South Sudan and stuff last year. And so kind of through all this different, I like to be in the field. I like to be on the ground, kind of really engaged in research on the front line, if you will, trying to actually interview the key actors to understand kind of what's driving this conflict, what are the broader ramifications. And then, through that, trying my best to kind of help, whether it's the U.S. government or other international partners and stuff, kind of make sense of what's happening in this part of the region and hopefully start to put together some policies that kind of help you address some of the conditions of violence, or at the very least, don't make things any worse. And then also to try to, through avenues like this, hopefully try to kind of situate Africa within the broader kind of geopolitical context that I think listeners to this sort of podcast would be interested in maybe understanding a bit more about, because it's a region that doesn't get covered a lot, or gets covered in very kind of broad brushes maybe in a lot of international media. So I try as much as possible to add some nuance and some texture, if you will.
In that answer, you made my job very easy because you gave almost a perfect kind of reverse run of show for what we're going to talk about today. So let's kind of take that approach. Start here. You've interchangeably referred to Africa and region. So how should we understand, let's say, West Africa versus like the Horn of Africa versus the continent as a whole? Like, how should we like map and understand where we're talking about on this episode today?
That's very good. Thank you. I need to watch my words carefully if any serious Africanists are listening, and you've reminded me of that. I think it's well, for starters, right? To the old kind of joke, Africa's not a country, right? It's obviously a continent. My research principally focuses on what's called interchangeably sub-Saharan Africa, and all these terms are kind of politically contested in some way or another, but broadly speaking, I would say I kind of work in two main regions of Africa, that being West Africa and the Horn of Africa. And both of those definitions and stuff can be kind of quite nebulous. For example, to take West Africa, Nigeria is a country that would kind of be situated in some ways, it's kind of situated in two different regions of West Africa. There's what's called, often referred to as the Sahel region, which is kind of the semi-arid kind of region in Northwest Africa, a bit south of the Sahara, but not along the coast. So this is an area that, originally it's a term that kind of referred to the climate of the area, as I said, very kind of semi-arid, and with kind of patches of desert and stuff. But more recently, it's kind of used as a political term for typically like the Francophone West African countries that are landlocked in that region and have, in the security space, kind of in the epicenter of kind of terrorism and security challenges recently. And so Nigeria, even though it's an Anglophone country, northern Nigeria, actually where I am physically right now on some quick research, has a lot of ties and kind of cultural and historical and ethnic ties with many of those kind of with the broader Sahel. But then Nigeria is also a coastal country, right? The southern half is in what would be called like littoral West Africa, or what have you. So this is the Gulf of Guinea region. The climate's more tropical. To kind of generalize quite a lot, the north is predominantly Muslim, the south is predominantly Christian, although there's a lot of diversity in there. So just kind of even within, West Africa, you have kind of these different sub-regions, if you will, that not only in terms of kind of climate or kind of the kind of social dynamics, but very much now in political dynamics and security dynamics. In some ways, they're kind of they're distinct, but there's also the lines are quite blurred. And then, we could talk about the Horn of Africa, which I didn't prepare for tonight, but that's there. Yeah. It's quite simple because you've only got about 3,000 years of highly contested history, and so things are very clear cut. But yeah, maybe let's stick to West Africa for now.
Yeah, how about you just give a quick bit of context? Maybe we'll say that for part two. Quick context on, because one thing we're getting is sort of a picture of your work. Horn of Africa, just introduce it, and then we'll focus on West Africa moving forward.
Okay, sure. The Horn of Africa, so it's the region, geographically, it really does kind of look like a horn or almost like an elbow sticking out, right? So the countries that are typically, that are kind of almost always considered part of the Horn are, Ethiopia kind of in the center, and then Somalia, Eritrea, there's the de facto state of Somaliland, and then people often consider Sudan and South Sudan part of the Horn as well. So it's kind of the countries that border that either kind of border the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and kind of northern Indian Ocean directly, or in the case of like Ethiopia and now South Sudan, are kind of, just adjacent to that, but for, again, social, historical, and very much these days political reasons, are very much kind of integrated into that system. So you can almost think of it as like a broader regional political system, if you will. A lot of people, a lot of analysts and historians and stuff consider Kenya as well to be part of the Horn. The other end, the kind of broader context here, and actually there's quite an interesting distinction in some ways between, say, West Africa and East Africa in this regard, but with the modern map of Africa, the boundaries are all based on colonial borders that were drawn up in kind of an ad hoc and different manner in the late 19th century. And there's some variation in the continent. In some places, the colonial powers used physical boundaries like rivers and mountains and stuff as kind of the demarcation point between their different colonies. And of course, this was a very intense kind of geopolitical competition. So there was often rivalries, and there was kind of a race to claim this area over another. But in many areas, and I think West Africa's probably a better example of this than the Horn. Some of the borders were kind of quite arbitrary, and to some extent, at least in terms of the kind of social context, right? So you'd kind of divide certain communities, and so that's why I say, for example, northern Nigeria today, a lot of communities have very strong ties with some of the neighboring states, because an ethnic group, the boundaries aren't, the international borders aren't drawn around to reflect what that ethnic group would consider their territory. They're instead kind of divided between different states. So and the Horn is a bit different and interesting, and very kind of a lot of the political tension, if you will, it actually kind of has a history rooted in the fact that the Ethiopian Empire was a very strong, powerful, at least by the late 19th century, a powerful African empire that actually competed with the colonial powers, avoided its own colonization, but in turn kind of settled and conquered and colonized other areas. And so to this day, there's also kind of contestation and conflict over what should the borders be in the Horn of Africa, in large part over this kind of definition of the Ethiopian state, and kind of almost a form of kind of local African colonialism, if you will. But as I said, it's a very long, complex, and contentious history.
Now that we have that picture, I'm thinking of our listener base in the overall arsenal of democracy frame. They're going to think of, or they're going to want to think of this region, especially West Africa, specifically in this conversation, through the lens of both counterterrorism and then obviously great power competition, China, Russia, the broader West, et cetera. Though I think maybe separating the European from the American is actually more useful in this context than it normally is when I refer to the West. Let's start first with the great power competition frame. How should we, which I'm sure you can just recite off the top of your head, how would you contextualize your study and just current events in West Africa through that frame? Then we'll do counterterrorism a little later.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's an important question, and one that I think understandably is on the minds of a lot of listeners and people in not just the political elites, but kind of well-informed readers in places like DC and Europe. It's a question. It is very significant and important, and it has material consequences on the ground. But it's also, not a framing that I think a lot of people would kind of instinctively kind of adopt here in terms of to try to understand like what's happening in a country like Nigeria. So, I think all to say that at this moment, what's really happening on the ground in terms of politics, in terms of security and stuff is, I think by and large, it's being driven by these kind of local factors, right? And there's a lot of these. This is a very complex region with, obviously complex history and a lot of different forces at play. And I think that sometimes in the Western media coverage, I think especially these days, kind of with the discussion of Russia, there's kind of a tendency to kind of confuse cause and effect. And so, the fact that there have been all these coups in West Africa recently, and the fact that Russia is, increasingly making overtures to these military regimes, and that some of these military regimes are kind of diplomatically aligning with Russia, and in the case of Mali at least, and probably some other countries now, actually inviting in, Russian military forces and stuff. That's kind of seen as, oh, okay, well, this is the new front in great power competition, and this is essentially, when bad things happen, it's because Russia is behind it. When good things happen, it's because the U.S. or the West. This is what we're pushing for. In terms of the great power competition framing, there can be this tendency both to kind of conflate or misconstrue cause and effect, and then also maybe to, in some instances, at least from some commentators, to downplay the kind of adverse or detrimental impacts of kind of the Western interventions in the region. I think particularly in the Sahel states, where it was that there are a lot of conspiracies about that you'll hear in the region. That this was all about France, trying to retain economic control or whatever. And I think, that I think that that's simplistic. I think that a lot of this was actually driven by kind of, mutual interests and between Western powers and kind of West African states in controlling terrorism and the spread of terrorism. But these interventions in places like Mali and Burkina, especially, they weren't doing the job, right? Insecurity was increasing, violence was increasing, and stuff. And so sometimes this great power competition framing, especially in light of, I think, the coup in Niger last year, it can kind of be used a bit simplistically, both to kind of deny the very complex factors on the ground that are behind a lot of this, the insecurity in the region, the political turbulence, all that stuff. But it can also kind of be a way to, in some ways, wash the hands of, say, whether it's the U.S. or France, from some of the problems that the region is now facing, and say, oh, well, it's now that Wagner's coming in, and the Wagner Group is, their human rights record and their callous disregard for human life is as manifest in West Africa as it is in Ukraine. They commit horrible atrocities. I think that their approach to counterterrorism is completely counterproductive in the long run, because it involves, the kind of, burning the village to save it, and kind of creates the conditions for further popular anger against the government. So this is in no ways to say that, that approach is working or good. I think it's bad for the region at the end of the day. But then it's also like, that shouldn't serve as an excuse to say, oh, well, things were going great under, when the French were, very involved in counterterrorism in Burkina or Mali or whatever. Because I think, the general trajectory in a place like West Africa has been, the trend lines have been pretty bad over the past decade. Then I think when you get to, the other kind of component of great power competition, at least in DC speak these days, when you get to talking about China, right, it's always on the agenda. China is a very different sort of kind of, its engagement with African states is very different than Russia, right? China comes with a massive GDP. It has huge kind of resources at its disposal and stuff. And compared to, Russia is a much smaller economy. It doesn't have as much. It doesn't have as much in terms of resources and stuff, but it has certain kind of, specialties, right? And some of that is providing military equipment, but also increasingly through like the Wagner Group, now rebranded as Africa Corps, the kind of provision of these mercenaries and private security that can serve both for kind of protecting the regimes of some of these African states, and also, engaging in some form of what they consider counterterrorism. So China is not kind of as hands-on in the security space and stuff. Their main influence in the continent, I would say that their influence is much greater than Russia's, has come through kind of the provision of economic, I would say, investment, as well as, some of it is kind of economic aid, but most of it is really investment, right? Foreign direct investment. And this is one thing that kind of contrasts with typically the American and the European approach, which kind of focuses more on humanitarian assistance and development assistance and stuff. With the Chinese, they kind of frame this as, well, no, this is a kind of an investment in your infrastructure, an investment, or like offshoring our companies into there, right? So it's commercial. It's about mutual economic gains and stuff. Now, of course, a lot of the Chinese investment historically has in fact been driven by, kind of like state-owned enterprises or parastatals or stuff. So it's not entirely kind of like, it's certainly not entirely a free market endeavor. Some of it is very political. And then the Chinese have bought, kind of political influence in these countries. And in some countries more than others. A couple of examples, Zimbabwe is a very prominent one, where they, their claim that, oh, our investment doesn't come with any political strings attached. Well, that comes under scrutiny, because it turns out that they can actually align with one political faction or another. I mentioned Zimbabwe because there were reports that they kind of gave the green light to a coup against Mugabe back in 2017. But, so even China, though, in the past few years, I think as a result of the relatively limited return on investments in some of these countries, and then kind of the post, the kind of economic slowdown with COVID and stuff. There are better experts, including experts at Hudson, who can speak to that more than I, but they've started to reduce some of their FDI. So they're still a very significant economic player on the continent. They do promote, I think, they do promote a political vision a bit. I wrote a report for Hudson back in 2020 about kind of the ideological dimensions of the China-Africa relations, where, especially under Xi Jinping, compared to 20 years ago, they're not just doing business in Africa. They are principally there to kind of do business, or at least that's what it looks like. But they become a bit more assertive. They kind of, they do, they partner, especially with political parties that maybe share some sympathies with them or some general ideological alignment. They kind of promote, some of their kind of global vision. They bring African political cadres over to China for, kind of like party instruction. They actually opened up a school even in Tanzania to train kind of regional political parties in East Africa. So they have, they're starting to do a bit more. I think, they've grown more confident and more, assertive and aggressive under Xi Jinping in the global space. So part of that is just their way of saying, we're this big new global power, and we have an alternative vision to the U.S. and Europe. But by and large, their influence still has been principally economic. What that looks like over the next 10 years, I think, is a bit unclear. As I said, with some of this kind of the China significantly reducing some of its investments in the region, including its Belt and Road investments, whereas the Gulf states in particular, and the Emiratis, I would say in particular, have become very, very involved and influential in the economic space, kind of putting in a lot of foreign direct investment, in some instances, in some countries, becoming quite involved in the politics and even in the conflicts. The Emiratis especially are kind of involved in this pseudo-proxy conflict in Sudan by way of their support for one faction that's fighting the Sudanese military. And so that whole conflict has drawn in not only the Emiratis, but the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Russians. It seems like some of maybe the bromides from the past decade, right? About, China is the ascendant economic power, and then Russia is this kind of shadowy mercenary force causing all these problems in the region or whatever. They're kind of the creeping new power. And, the United States is the status quo power, the United States and Europe. And it's kind of this three-way competition. I think that the reality is much more complex, setting aside even obviously the fact that in much of the region, it's not great power competition that's kind of fundamentally, I think, the driving force behind a given country's politics. But even in that space of kind of the international relations with Africa and stuff, you have the rise of these newer powers, the Gulf states and such, that are quite engaged and in some ways quite, in some instances, in some places, quite aggressive in pursuing their interests, and so becoming much more directly involved in say a conflict like Sudan's or even the Ethiopian civil war before that than the United States or China are. Again, the Russians are typically, because they have less of that economic influence. A lot of the influence that they do have does come through, whether it's direct military sales or increasingly the Wagner Group. They have no qualms about inserting themselves into a bloody conflict and helping make it bloodier. But I think in terms of kind of like the overall impact, what's really going to shape Africa moving forward, I think that a lot of it will be kind of in the economic sphere, and so it's going to be in this question as well about does all of this FDI, whether it was the billions in Chinese FDI over the past decade or so now, whether it's the Gulf money, the U.S. is trying to some extent to catch up, but it's we have a very different system than either the Gulf states or China, right? We don't really have these massive parastatals with billions of dollars. We don't have a massive petro-funded sovereign wealth fund, so it's a lot harder for the president can't just say, yeah, let's spend $4 billion in this country to build roads or whatever. It doesn't quite work like that in the American system. So I think that a lot of the question of kind of which countries have the biggest impact in the developmental trajectory of Africa, and then kind of by extension, which countries have the most influence there in terms of external powers. A lot of that will be driven. It'll be questioned in part on the of this, the impacts or the effectiveness, I would say, of some of the kind of the bigger economic investments on the continent. But that's, of course, not to downplay the fact that in some areas, specifically like now with the war in Sudan, countries like Somalia, even now in the Sahel with what's happening in Niger, that some of that maybe more old-fashioned, if you will, the kind of Cold War style rivalry and the proxy conflicts. I think that those have the potential to be quite impactful and quite destructive, which is one reason that essentially, no country in the region is kind of wanting to have their country be a battleground between, say, Russia and the U.S. or the different Gulf states. But of course, African leaders, African regimes, they try to play whatever competition is there. They're going to try to play that to their advantage, right? They don't want to pick sides. They want to get a bit of both. And you even see in a conflict like Sudan's, where originally the Russian government didn't kind of have an official diplomatic position, and the Wagner Group was aligning with one warring party. The Russian government is now making overtures to the other warring party, to the Sudanese armed forces. And neither the RSF, which is the kind of group that's or the paramilitary forces that's more aligned with Wagner, or the Sudanese armed forces are really saying, well, no, we can't work with Russia because they're playing both sides. At the end of the day, this is an intense civil war that both of those sides see as essentially existential. They've destroyed the country in the process. I mean, Sudan's undoubtedly the bloodiest conflict probably occurring in the world today, even though it's completely overlooked in international media because of Ukraine and Gaza and all of that. But these two sides, they're going to take whatever assistance comes in. So sometimes, sometimes this geopolitical competition plays out in the much more violent, more cynical manner, and than just this question of foreign direct investment, if you will.
So for the last two questions, number one, I'm wondering if you could just quickly, because you alluded to it a bunch of times in your answer, can you just allude to the counter-terror significance of West Africa specifically, especially in terms of like the past 5-6 years or so?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at it from the question of how much territory do the jihadist groups control, how much did they threaten, kind of existentially threaten the states of the region? West Africa is certainly one of the global hotspots for terrorism. It's emerging as one of the epicenters. I'd say that Somalia is the other area where the Al-Shabaab terror group is probably the most one of the largest and most sophisticated non-state armed groups in the world, and very much is kind of posing an existential threat in some ways to the very nascent and still weak Somali government. But in West Africa, the jihadist expansion, both geographically, territorially, but also in terms of manpower and kind of the strength of these insurgencies, has grown quite a lot over the past 5 years. And what's happened is that there's kind of been this growing spillover, wherein the jihadist groups that originally operated particularly in northern Mali and really kind of almost along the border with Algeria, so very much kind of in this heart of the Saharan desert, have been moving kind of further south and beginning to threaten the capitals of countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. But then increasingly, even since then, in the past 5 years, moving into some of the coastal West African states, still very much in the northern kind of the northern regions of those states and countries like Benin, Togo. There's a lot of speculation, but till date, no kind of concrete, very clear jihadist operations within northern Ghana. But it's very clear that the jihadists have some sort of networks there and are maybe using it for kind of smuggling and revenue generation and stuff. So the violence has been essentially spreading further south. And for the United States and the European countries as well, the European countries especially having concerns that go beyond counterterrorism, but are also very much focused around counter-migration. And so the EU has partnered with some, the European states have partnered with some very unsavory regimes in West Africa in an effort to try to, stem the flow of migrants north through the Mediterranean or even through the Atlantic Ocean into Europe. So the focus for the past few years has been on trying to kind of stem that flow of violence from the landlocked Sahelian states into the coastal West African states. So in the United States, there's something called the Global Fragility Act, which has as one of its kind of key regional components these 5 littoral West African states that are singled out for what's considered preventative programming, essentially an effort to try to bolster the resilience of these communities through both developmental but also security interventions to try to make them more resilient to the spread of terror groups from the Sahel into coastal West Africa, which of course is more kind of closely integrated into the global economy by virtue of its geography and demographics and all that stuff. Whether this will work, I mean, this is the big question for the next few years. I think the track record, again, of these kind of the counterterrorism interventions in the Sahel over the past decade has been pretty bleak. And so, the efforts from, say, the United States through the Global Fragility Act and stuff, they're trying to maybe adopt a slightly less militarized approach, maybe trying to develop more, kind of focus more on developmental assistance to some extent, to try to kind of address these issues of violent extremism more holistically. But it's still very much got a strong military component. This is still very much we're not at the point where the jihadists are really dialoguing meaningfully with any of these governments. It's a war, and they're trying to conquer these states. They're doing so through violence. So it remains a very militarized issue. So I really don't know kind of what the future holds for the region, but certainly the kind of worst case scenario is that the jihadist violence continues to spread throughout West Africa. That it's not contained, that it's targeting and disrupting these coastal West African states, and then contributing to all those things that the Europeans fear about, such as migration, the possibility for kind of transnational terror attacks. Right now, I don't think any of the West African groups are particularly planning or interested in striking, say, the American homeland or the European homeland. Though we see that in East Africa with Al-Shabaab, which I think has more kind of concerning or frightening global ambitions. But then there's always this question of, okay, well, if you just, if you let the problem fester for, 5 years or whatever, is that going to remain the case, right? So it's those sorts of concerns that I think drive a lot of the American and European security interest and counterterrorism efforts in the region.
I think that is an excellent place to end. James, this has been very illuminating, and it's helpful to kind of do a regional tour outside of the most obvious great power competition, arsenal of democracy areas this podcast typically covers. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Marshall.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.